The MacDonald's Phantastes is a mystical allegory about human love and desire. The journey of Anados is a symbolic discovery of what it means to truly love. So my lecture tonight is going to demonstrate what might be called a symbolic reading of a novel, an interpretation that considers how symbols work upon the individual reader's imagination to reflect their own spiritual journeys. There's really no way to discuss this in a framework that is applicable to everyone, but it's this premise that all imaginative literature is a mirror held up to nature, as Hamlet says. And it doesn't he doesn't mean that it's just the external nature and the representation of reality, but also the idea of our own natures being reflected by the literature we're reading. So all things are actually can become this mirror, not least of all art and entertainment. And because imaginative literature is both, we shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in the pages and in the poems of the books we have come to cherish, even if we don't recognize ourselves in them. In literature, we find symbols, call them archetypes, call them patterns or templates, descriptions of inner journeys. So keep this in mind. We should read everything as carefully as we would interpret our own dreams, because in a way, all of literature is our own dreams. All imaginative literature is this. So in this lecture, I'll cover the overview of the genre of what we're reading. It blends three major genres. I'll talk about the symbolic import of the setting of the forest. We were chatting before a lecture about the similarities between Lewis and Tolkien and their landscapes. We'll talk about the character Anados and his search for his marble lady, whom he sets free with song, and the story of Cosmo von Warstall, which can be seen as a microcosm of the entire novel itself. We're going to keep in mind the central question of the novel. What does it mean to truly love? Well, when Phantastes was published in 1858, the literary scene was in turmoil. It was changing. It was in transformation. In the early Victorian period, in the 1850s, you had this very moral earnesty, this push for social reform. MacDonald is participating in this in his own ways. And this was giving way to a more introspective, symbolic, mystical, sometimes an occultist interest in literature and meaning making. We were talking a bit about Eliot's interest in the occult in the first reading group of The Wasteland Today, and that really began in the Victorian period. We have this resurgence of an interest in the supernatural. What happened in 1858? Well, shortly after, the next year, you have Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species published, along with Tennyson's Idylls of the King. So you have this medieval revival in full swing, and you also have large-scale social and religious shifts in the intellectual culture. So this is something to really keep in mind, because I think George MacDonald's book, Phantastes, and much of his poetry and novels are bridging this gap between science and the world of spirit, in much the same way that Wordsworth's poetry did. So if you've watched my previous lecture on the survey of English poetry, and you've seen the one on Victorian poetry, you know a little bit about this already. Into this world comes George MacDonald and his writing. And here's a photo of MacDonald himself. He's sporting the beard and the longer hair, which was a new style then. And you see William Morris doing it with the Hammersmith Socialists. You see the Rossetti clan and the Pre-Raphaelites doing the same thing. His family, he comes from a conservative family, wasn't too much of a fan of the beard and long hair, but it bespoke of this medieval interest and also in social reform. George MacDonald was a Scottish Congregationalist minister for a time who turned novelist, poet, lecturer, and visionary. One could say that he always was a visionary, who would become one of the most well-known and beloved Victorian writers in England and in America. He was incredibly popular, both sides of the Atlantic. And during his American tour, he met some of the most famous American literary figures. Mark Twain was familiar with MacDonald's work. Everybody, many kids were reading MacDonald. He met Emerson. And so he was introduced into the intellectual culture in America during his trip. But he was also incredibly popular as a children's author in England. He was born in Huntly, Aberdeenshire in 1824, and he grew up immersed in Calvinist culture, and a particular kind, a Scottish Calvinism, which was a theology he would later move away from. However, even though he moved away from it, you can still see it within his work. It's a strange thing. He actually rejected Scottish Calvinism at an early age. When he was a boy, he was explained the doctrine of predestination, that God predestined some souls to heaven and others to hell. And the young boy, MacDonald, said that he didn't care if God loved him, if he didn't love everyone. And so this was the beginning where he was starting to kind of depart from the Scottish Calvinism. But we can see this visionary Reformed tradition even living on despite what many would call his universalism. He was what you could call a Christian universalist. A universalist is someone who believes that everyone goes to heaven. A Christian universalist is someone who believes that everyone will eventually go to heaven by virtue of Christ. So it's slightly different. And we had a conversation about this when we talked about Julian, and Dr. Landreth came and talked about the mystical writings of Julian and Hadwick. But just as Bloom said, that Spenser is a part of this left wing, the left wing, the left wing of the Protestant movement, the visionary left wing of the Protestant movement. So is MacDonald in that, and you can see how there are currents of that Calvinism kind of living on in some of his later visionary writings. In a way, he's kind of like Dickinson. We saw Dickinson be a part of this tradition and also be like separate from it in interesting and complex and creative ways. So with a love for people, he took up the responsibility of the pulpit. This was one of the highest callings in his culture. He studied at Aberdeen and then at a seminary in London, but his preaching career was short-lived. Because of his heterodox views on hell and divine love, he was made unwelcome in many Congregationalist pulpits. So instead, literature became his true pulpit, and the lecture his lectern. He was among the first promoters of literary education among the lower classes. He would often go and lecture to mechanic societies, to local book clubs, to women's reading groups, which, by the way, were really the cradle of the university English department. Universities didn't have English departments. That was something in the late 19th century that originated in Scotland. Well, it all began with book clubs, really. So it's interesting to see his interest here was already developing before there was even a university status for what he was doing. So MacDonald here is credited for being one of the founding writers of the Oxford fantasy movement, or fantasy movement more generally. He was friends with Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland. He influenced J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. In fact, it was Lewis who said that Phantastes baptized his imagination. It's funny to read about it in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. He had seen the Everyman's edition in the bookstall at the train station many times, and he finally picked it up and read it on a train trip, and he was totally changed by it. So MacDonald's is a work of really metaphysical allegory, full of symbols, of quests, of dreams that dramatize the soul's interior pilgrimage. So how do we call this work? What do we classify it as? Because we're going to apply some literary criticism, we have to say, well, what is the work trying to be? And then we have to judge whether it lives up to that. These are the basics of criticism. But it also helps to know when you're reading a book for the first time what to expect. And I think there are three categories we could place this book into that would help. The first is allegory. We began the Poetics of Enchantment with Plato's allegory, so we're familiar with allegory. This is fair, especially if we read it in the sense of Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, or in the same vein as John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, both books that George MacDonald loved. The narrative arc of Phantastes is one of spiritual growth and progression, and it provides a symbolic map upon which we might come to understand our own templates of spiritual development, a story in which open and multivalent symbols progress in allegorical pageant over the symbolic arc. So you can't map it on a one-to-one ratio. It's kind of like Spenser's allegory. Each figure can operate on multiple levels. There are layers to the allegory. I think this is true for MacDonald's Phantastes. But I think it's wrong to consider this as an allegory in the vein of Plato's allegory, at least formally, because Plato will explain the one-to-one correlations between the figures and situations of his allegory and the real world. It is an allegory of two levels, uh, the meaning figuratively and then the meaning literally. And then, Plato very nicely tied it off at the end, had Socrates explain it. There is no explanation in this book. And that's why it's so open and dialogic in that way. It can move with our own imagination, much like Dickinson poetry we read last week. It's open-ended and invites us into the process of meaning making. And this is really important. In fact, to that point, here's a fantastic quotation from his essay, The Fantastic Imagination, which he says, "A genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. If my drawing, on the other hand, is so far from being a work of art that it needs 'this is a horse' written under it, what can it matter that neither you nor your child should know what it means? It is there not so much to convey a meaning as to wake a meaning. If it do not even wake an interest, throw it aside. A meaning may be there, but it is not for you. If again you do not know a horse when you see it, the name written under it will not serve you much. At all events, the business of a painter is not to teach zoology." He was getting a lot of letters from readers who were saying, "What does this mean? I feel like you're trying to say XYZ. Is this what you're saying?" And people wrote to Wordsworth the same way, and he won't explain it. He says this has to be a process in which the meaning is made. There is meaning there, and it's going to differ on what's discovered depending on who is reading it. So that's the first genre, I'd say. This is in the category of imaginative allegory, from Spenser to Bunyan. Next, I would say that this is whoops, we're not quite there yet, is a romance. A romance in the sense of what we learned with Malory and what we're going to read with Chaucer and Marie de France, even with Margaret Cavendish. We know that romance is not a love story between man and woman. It's not, if you go to the romance category of Barnes and Noble, we're not talking about that. It's not necessarily love stories, although this is a love story. It's a tradition of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, and Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, as we've read in this course. You've got some great prerequisites for understanding George MacDonald from everything that you've read so far. It's really set you up to lead up to this. And in the next semester, when we read Chaucer and Marie de France, you'll also have some things to rely on in your memory and knowledge. But this book is styled a fairy romance, he says, after the medieval genre of romance. A symbolic journey of transformation. Think of the Grail quests. Some other examples of this would be Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which I believe we're reading next semester. The Faerie Queene, of course, Parzival, and the romances of Chrétien de Troyes. They're journeys of development. A hero goes into the forest, encounters adventures, learns things, develops, grows, and then returns. Phantastes is a modern descent of this form. So in the same tradition here as romance. And then finally, the third way that I think we could read this poem is as a dream work. And I want to explain that. You might have noticed in your edition, it should have come with the epigraph from the German romantic poet Novalis. George Friedrich Philipp Freiherr von Hardenberg is his full name. Novalis was the pen name, which I'm sure you'll agree is much more poetic um, and easier to say. Novalis. Let me pull up his quotation with the translation because George MacDonald does not provide the English translation of Novalis's theory of the dream poem. So on the left is the German, on the right is a translation. One can conceive of stories without coherence, yet with association like dreams. Poems that are musical and full of beautiful words, but are without sense and coherence. At most single intelligible stanzas like fragments from the most diverse things. This true poetry can, at best, possess an allegorical meaning, generally in an indirect effect, like music. Now, I'm breaking here from the text to say that I'm thinking of MacDonald. It must wake a meaning. That's just the effect of music, something beyond words. Thinking of Shruti here, and many other musicians among us. That is why nature is so purely poetic, like the chamber of a magician or a physicist's workshop, a nursery, a storeroom, or a junk room. A fairy tale is like a dream image without coherence, a collection of marvelous things and events, for example, a musical fantasy, the harmonic sequences of an Aeolian harp, nature itself. In a true fairy tale, everything must be wonderful, mysterious, interconnected. Break here. And you might think, wait, if it's interconnected, then why isn't there coherence? And he's talking about, no, there's no overarching interpretive hermeneutic coherence. Everything has its own life unto itself, which is kind of how Coleridge describes his symbol in his later Statesman's Manual. That everything is interwoven like a dream, everything alive, returning to the text, each in its own way, Novalis says. All of nature must be strangely interwoven with the entire spirit world. Here enters the time of anarchy, of lawlessness, of freedom, the primal state of nature, the time before the world began. The world of the fairy tale is entirely opposed to the world of truth, and therefore so completely similar to it as chaos is similar to completed creation. Now, a world of truth, I think, is the world we inhabit. Doesn't mean that this is antithetical to truth. It's another way of getting at it. This is what Novalis is saying. Because romance and allegory work by virtue of this dreamlike function. So I think this is the most important way to read the poem. You should read it like a dream. You should encounter it as one of our own dreams, I think. And for Novalis, in his Hymnen on die Nacht, he'll say, the dream will break our fetters off. And there's something redemptive about the dream and the fairy tale, I think, for Novalis. I want to talk about the setting of Phantastes. It's set in a forest, an enchanted forest, like so many of the places in Malory's tales, and Marie de France, and Chrétien des Troyes. It's the magical fairy forest, the enchanted forest of the medieval romance. We're going to see this in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I'm flagging that again. Gawain rides through the bleak winter forest before reaching the Green Chapel, and the forest is the place of testing, of isolation. It's spiritually charged, and it's the journey through it that makes the growth happen. In Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, knights ride forth in adventure, and the word adventure has this meaning of chance. Once you enter into the forest, you're in the world of chance. It's this potential doorway to marvels and moral failures. You might think also of Dante's Selva Oscura, the dark wood of the Inferno. It's going into the descent, and the wood is this other world. They are, I was reading Sir James Frazer for the Wasteland course, and he has a wonderful chapter on forests, talking about the primeval forests of old, of Europe and of England, and it's just so enchanting to read. But he makes this case that the original temples of humankind happen to be the forest, this place of danger, of mythic danger and adventure, and how early human beings imagined these spiritual symbols. The shadowed depths of the woods of romance are actually the same as the unconscious if you think about it. You could think of it on this psychological level, because what you have is really a separation, a level of three. You have above the treetops the realm of the sun, the eye, what is aware in light. And then you have this layer of leaves, and then beneath it, filtered light, this other world, which is just below the surface of awareness, the world of the sun. And so when you go into the forest, it's like going into yourself. It's this space of the unconscious. And what happens when you do that? You're greeted with all sorts of things. It's the green shaded thought. Marvell has a great poetry on the greenwood, and it's this place of the enchanted encounter. The other thing is concerned with Anados. His name means pathless or without a way. It's going back to the Greek. And in a way, he doesn't have a way. He's constantly straying. And we hear the word vague feeling comes up a lot in this novel. Anados has a vague feeling about something, that he shouldn't do something, but he does it anyway. He feels like he should stay on a path. He doesn't. That's part of the errancy, which is going to be corrected in Anados. To go back to this passage of when he awakes in chapter 1, um, this is when he wakes up and he's remembering what happened the night before on his 21st birthday. And he goes to his father's dresser. He's hoping to find some information about his father. And he opens one of the secret latches, little pigeonholes, and all of a sudden he's greeted by this small fairy woman who claims to be one of his grandmothers. And she says, "Look into my eyes," and eagerly, he says, "I did so. They filled me with an unknown longing. I remembered somehow that my mother died when I was a baby. I looked deeper and deeper till they spread about me like seas, and I sank in their waters. I forgot the rest, till I found myself at the window whose gloomy curtains were withdrawn, and where I stood gazing on a whole heaven of stars, small and sparkling in the moonlight." Just to stop there. Notice the seas and the waters, this longing having to do with this encounter with the feminine. He's expecting an encounter with his mysterious father and who he was. He doesn't get that. Instead, he gets this longing for the seas, for the waters, symbolic of womanhood, the moonlight. We saw this in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, suggestive of the goddess. Below lay a sea, still as death and hoary in the moon, sweeping into bays and around capes and islands, away, away, I knew not whither. Alas, it was no sea, but a low bog burnished by the moon. Surely there is such a sea somewhere, said I to myself. A low sweet voice beside me replied, and fairyland, Anados. I turned but saw no one. I closed the secretary and went to my own room and to bed. And that's the night before. The vision of the desired object here becomes more real than what is there. Surely, because of what he longs for, there must be an object for it. And this is in the great, uh, well, Western tradition of St. Augustine's apologetics. which was an important figure for the Scottish Calvinists and many of the English Calvinists as well. This idea of longing. St. Augustine said that our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, O Lord, speaking as he did in his confessions, addressing God. This is the same thing that C.S. Lewis is going to take in his autobiography. His argument for God is that our desire for the other world is so great that necessarily there must be another world. Man longs for water, there's such a thing as water. For food, there's such a thing as bread. For this other world, there must be some greater spiritual reality somewhere. And this is really where you get all of Lewis's theology. I'd say it really hangs upon the apologetics of desire. And this is an early formulation of it in MacDonald, all a part of his early tradition and carried forward with the Inklings. So he's without a path, he's without a mother, he's without a father. He's lacking because that's what desire is. It's the awareness of an absence. And that's what his name means, without a path. So that was chapter 1. Let's go to a small portion from chapter 2. This is at the end. So he wakes up, he hears water running, he remembers that he was promised he would enter into fairyland, and this is where he enters. Faint traces of a footpath, much overgrown with grass and moss, and with here and there a pimpernel even, were discernible along the right bank. This, I thought, must surely be the path into fairyland which the lady of last night promised I should so soon find. I crossed the rivulet and accompanied it, keeping the footpath on its right bank until it led me, as I expected, into the wood. Here I left it, the path, without any good reason, and with a vague feeling that I ought to have followed its course, I took a more southerly direction. So in a way, this is the crossing of the stream, the great archetypal baptism. You must cross into the water, into this new world. Often in Celtic mythology with the other world encounters, there's some veil or threshold that must be crossed. It's usually water. We see water very important to the vegetation myths as well that we've been studying in our other course on the wasteland. But the wood also is within and without. So he follows it without any good reason. Now, the last chapter I want to show you before we get into the symbolic episodes is chapter 3. This is a dangerous wood. This is when he encounters the country maiden coming towards him. And he says, she seemed afraid of being observed by some lurking foe. Trust the oak, said she. Trust the oak, and the elm, and the great beech. Take care of the birch, for though she is honest, she is too young not to be changeable. But shun the ash and the alder, for the ash is an ogre. You will know him by his thick fingers, and the alder will smother you with her web of hair if you let her near you at night. All this she uttered without pause or alteration of tone. I was reading a little bit of the Welsh poet Taliesin. He has a poet, he has a poem that it's about the trees. And the oak, if you go back into mythology, it's a very important figure, a regal figure. The priest of Nemi dwelt in an oak grove. This oak flowers at midsummer instead of in the spring. It's also, the Druids were called oak seers. So this has a certain Celtic valence to it as well. The beech, interestingly, is a common synonym for literature because the word book comes from the word beech. Now, the Gothic word for letters, buchstabe, goes back to the beech. So there's something kind of literary going on there. But the ash and the alder, the ash was believed to have been cruel, that grass and corn couldn't grow in its shade. So this goes very, very back, but MacDonald has an awareness of this and is drawing on some of this mythic tree lore from the Celts, it seems. And we'll meet the Maid of the Alder soon. Let's see. Now, in chapter 6, he discovers the Marble Lady. This is a key moment because this is what sets him on his path. When he finally has an object to pursue, and I do mean object because that's what she is for him, at least at first. Chapter 6, he discovers the marble statue of a lady and brings her to life by singing, but she flees from him. And we learn later more about what's going on there. He has a strange power of speech, we might say, much like the ancient mariner. And as the story unfolds, we can see that Anodos is a poet. He's got a magical power with his words, with his songs. So after he awakens the Marble Lady, a statue brought to life through his song, he becomes obsessed with pursuing her. And he's convinced that she represents his ideal of beauty and of love. And when he finds her again in the forest, she flees. And then later, he encounters a woman who seems to be the Marble Lady, but she's not. This figure is actually the Maid of the Alder Trees, who was warned about in chapter 3. A dangerous, seductive spirit who tries to lure Anodos into spiritual ruin. And those of you who are familiar with John Keats's poem La Belle Dame sans Merci, you know that MacDonald is drawing from his imagination, from the romantic imagination. MacDonald was very influenced by the romantic poets. But this Maid of the Alder Tree, which looks like his Marble Lady, very similar to the whole episode with the Red Cross Knight in Spenser's Book 1. And MacDonald is drawing upon our memory of that. I think most of his readers would have had a memory of reading Spenser's The Faerie Queene as a child. This episode is MacDonald's critique of this obsessive, romantic, erotic pursuit of love, the shadow of love. Anodos is blinded by desire and ego. He has many flaws, and he mistakes the false image for the truth, even though he can tell those are not her eyes. But the desire has so clouded his mind, his discernment, that he almost falls complete prey to her. The Aldermaid uses a form of the ideal to tempt and deceive, a classic romantic allegory in the style of the Faerie Queene. So the Marble Lady represents, to him, she's an actual person we learn and meet, but to Anodos now, merely the unattainable ideal of beauty and truth, in the Aldermaid, a seductive distortion of that ideal, grounded in vanity and delusion, and it's with his own vanity and delusion by which this Aldermaid becomes so dangerous. Anodos later realizes his mistake. He says, I followed her because she was like the Marble Lady, and she turned on me eyes that had once shone from the statue, but not the same spirit. This is a classic moment in visionary romance, the test of discernment. Anodos fails it at first, almost fatally, but the shock of discovering he has been deceived is part of this moral and gradual education. That's the one symbolic moment that I think is going to be important for the rest of your reading. The other is the shadow. In chapter 8, striking scene, almost begs a Jungian interpretation. He says, this is when he encounters the cottage. So, better or worse, I went on, till I came to a little clearing in the forest. In the middle of this clearing stood a long, low hut, built with one end against a single tall cypress which rose like a spire to the building. A vague misgiving crossed my mind when I saw it. It's like he has the faculty within to know and to discern, but he doesn't listen to it. But I must needs go closer and look through the little half-open door near the opposite end of the cypress. Just a little. I just want to look at the half-open door. Reminds me of William Blake's proverb, if a fool persists in his folly, he will become wise. It's going to take a long time, but eventually I think it happens. A little bit more about tree lore here. Cypress, not just for the Celts, but also for in the ancient world, cypress was associated with death. It was a sacred tree to Pluto. It guarded the entrance of Hades, the underworld, and it's traditionally planted in cemeteries. Tennyson, around this time, In Memoriam, writes, dark cypress, ever sighing gloom. So, it's amazing how trees have this literary valence sometimes. Again, in Virgil's Aeneid, the cypress marks the threshold to the underworld. He describes a black cypress standing before him. So again, he doesn't listen to his intuition, but ignores it and goes instead. So he goes in. An irresistible attraction caused me to enter. The woman never raised her face, the upper part of which alone I could see distinctly. But as soon as I stepped within the threshold, she began to read aloud in a low and not altogether unpleasing voice from an ancient little volume which she held open with one hand on the table upon which stood the lamp. What she read was something like this. And this is kind of harrowing. So then, as darkness had no beginning, neither will it ever have an end, so then it is eternal. The negation of aught else is its affirmation. Where the light cannot come, there abideth the darkness. The light doth but hollow a mine out of the infinite extension of this darkness. And ever upon the steps of the light treadeth the darkness. Yea, springeth in fountains and wells amidst it, from the secret channels of its mighty sea. Truly man is but a passing flame, moving unquietly amid the surrounding rest of night, without which he yet could not be, and whereof he is part compounded. Like, this is so Jungian. It's the idea of the evil aspects of the self, the shadow side of the self, being integral to the self, one that must be acknowledged, not repressed, but integrated in an aware sort of way. But this is like a theology of darkness that she's reading from. It's pretty grim. Anados opens the door, even though he's told not to. And his shadow emerges, rushes toward him, meets him face to face, and there it is. He can't get rid of it. It follows him everywhere and diminishes his joy. So this is how he gets that shadow. I think it prefigures, too, spiritual rebirth. Now, finally, I want to talk about chapter 13, when Anados makes it to the fairy castle. He takes a book off the shelf and begins to read. He's refreshed by invisible hands, but something happens. This book is, in a way, a microcosm of the book that we are reading. And you should pay attention to the reading of books in Phantastes, because even when he was at the cottage girl's house, he was reading a romance, which is going to be important for the later half of the book. In fact, the name Cosmo is derived from the Greek word kosmos, and which is everything, the universe. It suggests the maxim of Hermeticus, as above, so below. The human being is a microcosm of the entire cosmos, we might say. And there are many extensions of this philosophy in writings from India, from the Jewish Kabbalah, of Neoplatonism and allegories of alchemy, and of Christian mysticism. It's this inner principle that's so without, so within, as above, so below, which invites, it demands a allegorical reading. So the story of Cosmo von Wehrstahl and the story of Anados are concerned with the question, what does it mean to love another person? And I think you've probably picked up on that from that mini story within the story itself. Cosmo is a solitary romantic figure. He's a student in Prague whose life changes when he buys this mirror from this strange antique dealer. And he discovers that the mirror reflects his room like a mirror would, with one difference that in the reflection, a woman enters into the room, beautiful, sorrowful lady, who visits night after night, seemingly unaware of Cosmo watching. And he falls in love with her through just this spectacle. And he begins transforming his room. He rearranges things. He gets rid of the skeleton, which was scaring her. And he wants to make it nice, but she's not in his room. She's in the reflection of his room. So, driven by longing and desperation, there's that longing again, which has a strange spiritual power of, we might call it manifestation in this book. Cosmos performs this magical ritual to summon her, and she does. She's summoned. She appears in his room and begs him to free her by breaking the mirror, warning that she may vanish forever. She's under some kind of curse attached to the mirror. And here's the crux. Cosmo is torn by love and its opposite, the desire for possession. And those two desires must be separated out in the action. Cosmo hesitates, but ultimately chooses her freedom, even though it means that he will never see her again. So he believes. The mirror is broken. He falls back unconscious. And uh, he awakes. Cosmo learns that she's a noble woman who was afflicted by a mysterious curse and ailment, but she's better now. She's recovered, and eventually he hears that she is free, for he had broken the mirror before collapsing. And before he dies, because breaking the mirror was an action that was so violent that it hurt him. It was a fatal wound he gave to himself and to the mirror. So there's even this connection between the mirror and the ego, the self. They meet one final time in real life uh, on the bridge in Prague, where she professes love, but Cosmo, being fatally wounded during his efforts to destroy the mirror, dies in her arms, having redeemed himself. So the action was choosing love, of not having, but the goodness of another over the desire to possess. And we see this with the girl with the crystal ball, which he takes, and in his taking breaks. That's something else that happened to Anados. But there are these parallels between Cosmo and Anados. And it just so happens that Anados takes down that story to read. We might say, well, of course, because MacDonald is writing the book and he wants to show this correspondence here. Well, yes, but also this happens when we read all the time. Uh, it's synchronicity, it's symbolic reading, it is the awareness, the directing of our attention by our unconscious to certain archetypes, symbols that coincide with things that are going on with us in our lives. And I think this is why we are inexplicably attracted to some poems, while why some lines will return in hours of silence into our minds, unbidden, because our unconscious has stored them, like the enchanted forest, and presents us with a stranger crossing our paths. Now, I want to conclude with Anados. This is what he says after he read the book. He read many books, apparently. And now I will say no more about these wondrous volumes, though I could tell many a tale of them, and could perhaps vaguely represent some entrancing thoughts of a deeper kind which I found within them. From many a sultry noon till twilight did I sit in that grand hall, buried and risen again in these old books. That Reading is a process of dying and resurrection, of going out and coming back, of entering the forest, being changed and coming back. It's not that these fairy books are in this fairy hall. These are books that we're reading. We have these fairy books, these poems. Carrying on. And I trust I have carried away in my soul some of the exhalations of their undying leaves. In hours of deserved or needful sorrow, portions of what I read there have often come to me again with an unexpected comforting. Who hasn't had that happen? Which was not fruitless, even though the comfort might seem in itself groundless and vain. Now, this story within a story shows us how reading will provide us these moments in which our unconscious will direct us to paths one needs to take. The imaginative experience is a vicarious one, but one no less filled with real perils and joys than our own stories, than our own lives. And this kind of reading, this really can't be taught. It's a type of close reading that involves not just close attention to the text, but also you as a reader. It asks you to take an interest in your own reading. The principle that states, as within the pages of imaginative literature, so within ourselves. It's a microcosm, as without, so within. And so, in some respects, you could take this story even further to see how this is a young man's encounter with his own self, or a part of him, that the lady represents, even, and must not be grasped or possessed or taken by the rational, but must be surrendered in a kind of love and receptivity to relinquish the selfish desire to possess. So true love is the willingness to let somebody go, and this is going to be important for the next reading when you complete the novel this week. You might think of some of the connections we've made. I think in the discussion we can do that. Um, how does this connect with the other works we've read? I think of Milton when he talks about Spenser. He says reading Spenser is way better than reading the Scholastics, because in the Scholastics you'll hear about what's right and what's wrong and why this or that is a sin. But in Spenser, you'll be tempted into the golden bowers yourselves. The reading experience will test you. Vicariously, you will fall, and vicariously, you'll be redeemed. That's part of the reading experience that Milton says, and that's in his essay, Areopagitica, talking about Spenser. You also think of the connections back to, okay, we have allegory. We certainly have Eriugena with these porous boundaries between the other world. But you do also have St. John. Greater love hath no man than this, than that he lay down his life for his friend. Gospel of St. John, which we read a month or two ago. There's also the letting go that Sir Bedivere had to do on the shores of that lake when his King Arthur was dying, and when what warred within him was love and honor and sentimentality and good pious feeling toward his king and this sword, and on the other hand, the command to get rid of it. And it takes 3 tries before he can finally let it go. And we'll think, too, when we read The Fellowship of the Ring, how Frodo will be asked eventually to let the ring go. So it's this quest of truly letting go. That's what the novel's about. So as you finish it, you might keep that in mind. For everyone on YouTube, thanks for watching. We're now going to start our discussion. So in the last lecture, last week, on the first half of Phantastes, chapters 1 through 13, I discussed how it was about love. The whole book is about love. And we considered how to read fantasies as an allegory, as a inheritor of the medieval romance, so we'll call it a romance, and as a dream vision or fairy tale after the mode described by Novalis. It's a story without rational coherence, that was the phrase from the translation, but one in which things are interconnected. So the coherence is something like an internal logic that binds the characters and desperate events across a narrative string. And this can come with some difficulties. One trap you could fall into in reading this book is, okay, if everything has significance, then I have to decode it like a code, and there can be a great burden about this interconnectedness, the anxiety of understanding the significance of every little thing. But I would say don't be overburdened and don't try to decode it because this is a room that's filled with things, and not every overflowing chalice is for you. If something in particular piques your interest, then, or if you find yourself inexplicably drawn to something, then explore. I think that's your unconscious directing you towards something within the story, something that holds meaning for you. But in this lecture, I want to pick up on last week, to pick up those threads of our last conversation, to talk more about the Marble Lady, because in this latter half of the book, we learn who she is. She is a real person. And as we follow Anados on his quest, we will consider the old lady of the island, the loss of his shadow, because he finally gets rid of it, and the final events that lead up to his death. But before we do, I want to consider this in light of Anados's own development. And this is a novel about how to truly love, but it's also a novel about intuition and listening to intuition. All throughout Phantastes, we hear of Anados noting his vague misgivings and feelings that something is not quite right, yet he'll go on to do it, whatever it is, anyway. So, for example, and make sure everyone's on mute. Sorry, I forgot to ask that, just so you don't show up in the recording or in the YouTube video. Here we go. So here was one of those moments. When he was deciding his path, he said, "Here I left it, the path along the stream, and with a vague feeling that I ought to have followed its course, I took a more southerly direction. When sensing the ash tree on his trail, he had a vague sense of discomfort possess him. When he encounters the white lady in marble under the spell of the grotto, he first becomes aware of the possibility of breaking the spell through his intuition. He says, at first, a vague anticipation gave way to a startling sense of possibility. And then later, when the maid of the alder tree, who's pretending to be the white lady, approaches him, his senses are right again. "It is your white lady," said the sweetest voice in reply, sending a thrill of speechless delight through my heart, which all the love charms of the preceding day and evening had been tempered for this culminating hour. Yet, if I would have confessed it, there was something either in the sound of the voice, although it seemed sweetness itself, or else in the yielding which awaited no gradation of gentle approaches, that did not vibrate harmoniously with the beat of my inward music. I love that metaphor. But something's not right. Something's inharmonious. Now, when the woman in the farmhouse contrasts her spiritual senses, her supernatural senses, to her husband who has none, she says, "But I believe my senses, as he cannot believe beyond his, which give him no intimations of this kind." And then finally, when Anados is approaching the hut with the shadow, we saw this last week, "A vague misgiving crossed my mind when I saw it, but I must needs go closer." So this is a book in which he's constantly having the right sense within him, the right intuition, but often not heeding it. So in other respects, this is a novel about developing intuition or listening to the voice. And this development and listening, I think, is concomitant with the greater theme of the novel, how to love. These two are interconnected. So we left off with Anados reading the story of Cosmo von Warstall in the fairy palace. And it's there where he learns to awake the Marble Lady once again. In the fairy palace, he says, "I was convinced there must be music in it, but that my sense was as yet too gross to receive the influences of those mysterious motions that beget sound." Not only was there sound, but there were statues, other marble ladies. And he begins to search for his white lady once again, and he'll learn to stop calling her his, but he hasn't yet. In chapter 16, he discovers her by singing to her. And as the song unfolds, the veil slowly is drawn. Ever as I sang, the veil uplifted. Ever as I sang, the signs of life grew, till, when the eyes dawned upon me, it was with that sunrise of splendor which my feeble song attempted to re-embody. And there's, of course, this great theme running through the course that we've had in our previous readings, too, that there are evil enchantments and there are good counter enchantments, and there are also positive enchantments. So, evil, good, counter enchantments. Those, I think, are the three classifications we can consider so far. Spells are states of consciousness that break the power of ill will. This would be the counter enchantment, or as what we saw in Shakespeare, a re-enchantment, an enchantment by a different route. And there is something particularly enchanting about poetry in MacDonald's Phantastes. Jack made this connection in our discussion to the singing as that of creation. So he goes to the mythic works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, both of whom were very well acquainted with this book, Phantastes. How the creator gods of those worlds, the Iluvatar and Aslan, sing into existence the world. And this goes back to the earlier concept we encountered in John's Gospel. The Logos, which is most often interpreted as word, can also be translated as argument, as sense, and as harmony. And it seems that the poetry of Anados participates in this creative energy of song. Not only Anados' songs, but the songs throughout, even the one that drew him out of the tower. The songs are what might be called logoi, are the little words, the little songs, which I'm borrowing Eriugena's word from his cosmology, the logoi, which are connected to the song of the Logos. So this is one way to interpret kind of how this fits into MacDonald's view of creativity and this whole fairyland cosmology, which is very strange. But the marble lady is awakened a second time, and as the song stops, she falls back into a statue, and in anxiety, Anados springs toward her and takes her down from the pedestal. And immediately, but no sooner had her feet ceased to be in contact with the black pedestal, she shuddered and trembled all over. Then, writhing from my arms, before I could tighten their hold, she sprang into the corridor with a reproachful cry, "You should not have touched me," darted behind one of the exterior pillars of the circle, and disappeared. And at this point, we remember the prohibition that was inscribed on the marbles. Touch not. And we've seen this prohibition before. We saw it in the Gospel of St. John when the resurrected Christ appears to Mary, and he says in the garden, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended. Another way to read that prohibition is one against possession. Do not get too close, do not cling, for you cannot possess me. I'm going away again, or I'm for another place. In our readings of Shakespeare and The Winter's Tale, we have another prohibition by Paulina this time, when she reveals the statue of Hermione. To Leontes, he reaches forward and she cries, "Good my lord, forbear, do not touch. You may adore, but you cannot make this haptic grasp with the body. This encounter is prohibited." And it's as though possession must first or only be granted spiritually. And so the white lady flies away and disappears, and Anathos follows, exits the fairy castle, finds himself on a barren heath, and eventually through these underground passages till he comes to the sea, where he attempts to die. He casts himself into the ocean, is borne upon the waves, is brought to a little boat, climbs into the boat, and the boat brings him to an island. Of course, we've seen this motif before, where the sea represents this other world, the old Irish myths, spoke of the sea as such. I talked a little bit about that in the Eriugena lecture. There's the boat in Cavendish's The Blazing World that carried the future empress into paradise, the other world. And there's also the ship of the ancient mariner, which was moved about by divine will. And we'll see this come up again in Chaucer. But what of the island of the old woman? What do we make of that? And I'm curious what you all think once we discuss in seminar and maybe even get a start on this after lecture in the Q&A. The island is this liminal space. We know that it's the spiritual realm, much like the other world of fairyland itself. We might consider it an other world within an other world, kind of like the House of Holiness in Spenser's Fairyland. Fairyland is this mythical place, but also you have this House of Holiness, which is this space set apart within the space. And the island is this sanctuary of peace in Phantastes, even of archetypal innocence. It has this floral abundance, an abundance of trees, which suggest a return to this childlike, Edenic, or prelapsarian state. Prelapsarian means before the fall, so it's kind of like the perfect state of paradise, where all is lowly and humble, associated with inner truth, and there's nothing evil. There's a line in that chapter. All the flowers of childhood looked up at me with perfect child eyes. And I think this does signal a return to a pre-egoic self, whether we want to call that Eden or this archetypal paradise within. You have to think everything is interconnected in this novel. I see this old lady of the island as he goes into the hut, finds the old lady with the young eyes. She's a type of the great mother, a Cybele, perhaps, the Magna Mater, this archetype of the wise woman or the mother who embodies time and paradox, sometimes the earth, in this ageless wisdom. I mean, she's exteriorly ancient, but has the young eyes, has these opposites of age and youth, mortality and eternity, and she's spinning. Like many of these figures in MacDonald's fairy tales, they often have these spinning grandmothers, which associates the spinning of fate in a way, the threads of life going out. So she's definitely within this symbolic realm too, operating on this higher level. She ministers to the soul's wounds with nourishment, with a lullaby. She sings the song of Sir Aglavail, which is very much like Novalis's encounter with Sophie von Kuhn at her grave. She's essentially this old woman is like a psychopomp, a conveyor or guide through these liminal spaces of death and renewal. So in her house are these 4 doors, and through each of them Anados enters. In one he sees the White Lady, and this is where I want to focus. And he learns that she loves the good knight he met in rusty armor. We saw him in a previous chapter. And he learns to bless them. Though invisible, he's just this witness to the scene, spectator. He speaks of himself as, let me be the moon of her night, since he cannot be the sun of her day. That's the place of the night. And he learns he's not in the place of the beloved, although he is beloved to a degree by her. But he accepts this lesser place. He sees himself dimly reflected in the knight's armor, suggesting that the true knight will be what he will become. There's that moment where, even though he's invisible, he can't be seen, he catches a glimpse of himself. And it's like he wants to be like him. But also through him, he's able to see what he is. And it's a moment that's fulfilling for him, but he's also grieved by it. It's clearly a moment of grief. Afterward, he comes back through the door and returns to the cottage island with the old woman with the young eyes. And he has many other journeys, which I'll not analyze, but he impetuously darts through the fourth door, not heeding the warning of the old woman, forbidding him to go through that door. And he loses consciousness, remembers nothing, simply awakes again in the cottage. And we learn that the old lady had to go retrieve him, in that somehow there's a price that's been paid for that retrieval because she rescued him. And because she rescued him, the seas are going to overtake the island, and he has to run. And she sends him away. At length she gently pushed me away with the words, "Go, my son, and do something worth doing." And the fact that she had to cross the threshold of timelessness to retrieve Anados, I think, is significant. We don't know what happened when she entered, but the situation is familiar. It's a very ancient story. There's a Sumerian version with a heroine called Inanna, who descends into the underworld to defeat her sister, the Queen of the Dead. I think the more popular one is Orpheus's descent into the realm of Pluto, the underworld, to win back Eurydice. And we think too of Christ's harrowing of hell, went into the grave, harrowed hell, and came back, paid a price. And in this way, the Old Mother becomes a goddess figure associated with Christ. And the association isn't very strange, especially if we consider what Julian of Norwich has explained to us. Jesus as a mother figure, the Messiah as God the Mother, is a metaphor that she played with in her shewings or her revelations. But the consequence of the old woman's rescuing Anados is this rising of the floodwaters, which is a biblical image of judgment, cleansing, death, and sometimes baptism. You think of the Red Sea as well. She tells Anados he must leave. But he's been changed, and we've reached the nadir of Anados's journey, I think, when he casts himself into the sea, and now he's starting to be reborn. She calls him son, which is the first time. And it's when she sends him out that she does that. Now, things happen. He defeats the giants. He joins up with these two brothers. But I want to talk about the shadow now, which was a point of our conversation last week in seminar, that we can continue it this week, because Anados does something worth doing. He puts his life in jeopardy for the service of strangers by helping defeat the giants, and he's the sole survivor. And really, he's the least worthiest to have survived. He is knighted, the town bestows their gratitude upon him, and he goes off as a knight. And he enters the enchanted wood, where his shadow disappears and conceit consumes him. And this is one of the evil enchantments of our course. And he begins to think, as his shadow disappears, that he's rid of it. And he says, "Still I rejoice and counted myself amongst the glorious knights of old, having even the unspeakable presumption. My shame and self-condemnation at the memory of it are as such, that I write it as the only and sorest penance I can perform. To think of myself, will the world believe it, as side by side with Sir Galahad?" And at this point, we begin to understand what happened to the shadow. He can no longer see it because it's completely overtaken him. And in this wood, amidst these thoughts of grandeur, delusions, really, of grandeur, he meets a radiant and very hostile knight who is larger, fiercer, but in some respects identical to Anados. This is, in a way, a very classic shadow figure. It's this inflated ego, perhaps even the projected idealized self-image, the persona that Anados has been aspiring toward and then finally adopted as his own. He's unconsciously constructed it. He suspects that this knight who has taken power over him is associated in some way with the shadow. And in a way, I think this might be true. This is another instance of his intuition being right. It is his idealized image, but greater. But he's powerful. He's merciless in a way. And his submission to the night leads him into the imprisonment in the tower, which marks Anodos's spiritual and moral crisis, because in that tower, alone with himself, he is forced to confront the falsity of his own heroic delusions of grandeur, his own pretensions. Now the tower, it's bare, it's square, it's without windows. He can't see out of it except from the top. It's, in a way, a prison of narcissism and illusion. And only when the moonlight shines upon it, when the orb enters the opening in the tower, it's only then where he experienced liberation. And we remember the presence of the moon and how important it is to earlier works we've seen. It can often symbolize the unconscious, especially the feminine aspect of the unconscious, which alone can soften and release the hardened ego. In a way, the tower is a part of his ego too, being a prison, and he's let out of it in the moonlight. The sunlight represents the harsh rationality, other times the ego, and when it returns, it brings the realization of suffering and delusion, of imprisonment. So the moonlight's cyclical visitation echoes the inner rhythms of grace and sorrow. It's kind of a microcosm of what this book is about. It's almost like each episode that happens to Anados is the same episode happening over. It's a spiral ascension in a way. When looking at it from above, it just looks like a circle. He's just going in circles. But no, when you look at it three-dimensionally, and we'll get there when we get to Flatlands, you'll see that it's actually a spiral staircase that ascends or descends. And the figures aren't moving in a circle. They're 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 rising, basically. Anyway, that's how I see the tower working here. But liberation eventually does come when he's able to instinctively step outside himself. The woman who sings him free is the same child whose magical globe he shattered earlier in the story. He hears her singing and instinctively just walks out of the tower through the door and wonders to himself why he had not done so before. And this figure, there's this beautiful scene of reconciliation. She herself has undergone her own transformation. And if we are to read all things in relation to Anados, she might represent the feminine aspect within himself, whom he has wounded with his obsessive desire to possess. We could also view her as just one of the other characters in this world that are moving about in this wood of transformation. Certainly, she has her own developmental arc of her own spiritual journey, and we get a glimpse of that here. And the symbolic act of forgiveness follows. Through grief and the grace of the Faerie Queene, she becomes this healing presence. She's one who sings her own songs, as opposed to just the songs in the globe. So it represents, again, to me, this is very Protestant in the way Spenser is. It's this removal of the exterior, our superstitious aids to devotion, and making it completely self-sufficient in a way that she no longer needs the support of the globe or what she had before. Just like Anados learns to take off his knight armor and leave it aside. I think he's in the Spenserian tradition here with this. I want to share this passage. Oh, this is what she does. Now I go back. Oh, excuse me. Now I go about everywhere through fairyland, singing till my heart is like to break. And wherever I go, my songs do good and deliver people. So she's found her purpose. Anados, he's not quite there yet. And her forgiveness and spiritual strength stand, I think, in contrast to his previous pride. She's very simple. There's a better, in the purest and spiritual sense of that word, simple. She embodies transmuted grief, the fruit of inner work. So after his release, Anidos takes off the armor. It's this act of renunciation. And he realizes he's no true knight. The armor was once a symbol of nobility, and and it became for him a symbol of illusion, of pride, in a way, an unearned status. So his removal of it is more of an acceptance of who he is, just as much as I think it's more of an acceptance of who he is than it is a rejection of who he wanted to be. It's also this sacrificial gesture. Not there yet. He says, then first I knew the delight of being lowly. I am what I am, nothing more. He's not a knight. And this is the crucial insight for all of us, really. I mean, we all kind of come to this position. One doesn't become whole by inflating the ego, by pretending to be something one isn't, but by relinquishing the false self and allowing what's native, what's natural, what's really in there to begin to grow. And I think we've all had our knighthoods to which our lives have been unfit. In some ways, we've tried to force it, the ideal to which we enslave our lives, trying desperately to conform ourselves. I've had several. The academy was certainly one. I had a grandiose idea of being an esteemed scholar, but then realized that really I was a teacher. So I put off the armor of the scholar for the gown of the educator. But for all of you, there might be a very similar move. Perhaps it's a profession. It could have been the expectations of your fathers or the laws of your religion. It could represent an impossible standard that you hold yourself slave to. It's the thing you wish you could become and you think you should become, but not what your life wants you to be, not what your life is. And the old Quakers have a saying, let your life speak. And so many people go about the world without ever letting their lives speak. Instead, they hold their lives captive. They tell their lives what they think they ought to do with it, instead of listening to the voice of their lives saying what they are. And I think until we confront our own limitations, we won't ever discover the true gifts that one has, and we need to give the world. And so with that, Anidos is really made new. And I think this is the turning point, the kind of rebirth for him. He says, another self seemed to arise, like a white spirit from a dead man, from the dumb and trampled self of the past. Doubtless this self must again die and be buried, and again from its tomb spring a winged child. But of this my history as yet bears not the record. Self will come to life even in the slaying of self, but there is ever something deeper and stronger than it, which will emerge at last from the unknown abysses of the soul. Will it be as a solemn gloom, burning with eyes, or a clear morning after the rain, or a smiling child that finds itself nowhere and everywhere? There's a sense like he doesn't know what it will be, but there's this openness to let it be, to let it grow, and a kind of curiosity about who he is, who this new self is, this true self. So having discovered his true self at last, and have gotten rid of this shadow, he begins his service to the knight. He becomes a squire. And it's at that point where he discovers the knight he had previously found with the rusted armor. This is his beloved's beloved, and he's going to serve him. So he meets in the forest this knight, and he puts himself in service to him. And one adventure that the two of them have is the discovery of a solemn ceremony, and this is at the very end. Chapter 23 builds to this very intense symbolic climax, a public, religiously cloaked sacrifice of youth under the guise of sacred ceremony. And they come upon it, and they're both very, very intrigued by the solemnity. And his master, the knight, because of the goodness of his own soul, is very impressed by what's going on. But Anidos begins to see through it because he's already developed that faculty of intuition. He knows he can listen to the true self because he can trust it. And this is that passage where Anidos is thinking, I was certain it was the really grand accompaniments that overcame him. So Anidos's vision of deception, while the knight remains dazzled by the spectacle, evokes Plato's cave and this very prophetic tradition that calls out false worship. This is very Spenserian as well. This is the ritual murder masquerading as mystery. The white robes, the chanting, the astral alignment are perversions of the true spiritual life. The sacrificial victims are these innocent youths and maidens who are like holy offerings to a faceless idol. And this represents the shadow side of religion, what Spenser was combating in his The Faerie Queene, ritual without life. Evil in the guise of beauty. But Anidos has learned to follow his intuition. But I, though somewhat shaken by the feeling expressed by my master, yet had an unaccountable conviction that here was something bad. And no more that adjective vague, which came up so often, an unaccountable conviction. Even his admiration and love for the knight doesn't blind him. He's self. He's Anidos. He listens and is aware of this inner balance. So when Anidos, he rushes forward, he pulls down the wooden figure from the throne, and he enacts this very prophetic iconoclasm. We saw this destruction of the image in Spenser. Spenser's Red Cross Knight is led by Una, but quickly falls into deception when he's misled by the arch-image maker, or the arch-magus Archimago, and is seduced by Duessa, who's also a figure for institutional corrupted religion. And Anidos is battling the same thing. He moves forward with the intent of bringing the idol down, takes down the idol, and out of the abyss where the idol stood comes this great brute like a wolf that rushes out and tumbled him down. And this brute is the unmasked god, a demonic power that's fed by the sacrifice. And he slays the brute, and in so doing is slain as well. And that's the end of Anidos' story. Of course, the next chapter describes his death. And something we can discuss in seminar, I didn't have time to put it in this lecture, was that MacDonald's description of the stillness of death is so similar to the vocabulary that Wordsworth and Coleridge used to describe moments of spiritual awakening, moments of suspension of life. It's very romantic in the capital R sense. So Anidos dies in fairyland. He describes the experience as a spirit or as an awareness of the love surrounding him and his friends. He's buried. The white lady whom he rescued twice weeps over him. The knight whom he served and eventually saved tells of his honor, and he awakens eventually at home. And Anidos returns to the world that he left in the beginning of the novel, to where he briefly returned to by going through one of the doors on the old lady's island. But that was a dream. It was a memory. And he's kind of like Plato's philosopher. He goes back and returns to the shadow world. But he's also like Norwich, Julian of Norwich, who had a mystical experience and who spent the rest of her life trying to figure out what it meant, or living in the awareness of that experience. You think, too, perhaps of Eriugena's cosmology, in which all things are sustained and inhabited by God. There is, I think, for MacDonald, this is nearer to what Anidos comes to believe about evil, is that striking last sentence of the book. Yet I know that good is coming to me, that good is always coming, though few have at all times the simplicity and the courage to believe it. What we call evil is only the best shape which, for the person in his condition at the time, could be assumed by the best good. I love that. And isn't that kind of like Norwich's all shall be well? This greater good. And I think of Eriugena's cosmology too, because in that, evil is not a substance, but a privation, a non-being arising from the misuse of will. It's a momentary waywardness of the logoi in its return to the logos. And for Eriugena, suffering and brokenness must be understood within a wider context of the universe returning to the divine. And this is why I mentioned last week about Novalis's, oh, excuse me. This is why I mentioned about George MacDonald's Christian universalism, because he does believe that all things are returning and will eventually be brought back. And so I think this is part of that cosmology being reflected here. So in Phantastes, Anodos's sufferings generate this insight. His vision at the end is not a world free from sorrow, but it's certainly one that has become meaningful. And so I think the Phantastes vision is Eriugenian, where evil and suffering are reabsorbed into this divine pattern when seen rightly. But I'm curious what other connections you all are going to find when we discuss this in seminar on Wednesday.